Working on been good for me. Going back into this a little bit, I've had a chance to spend some time kind of reviewing some things I'd thought and kind of found some interesting things along the way, or interesting to me. So it's been good for me to look at this a little bit. You know, this all started with restoration, and I kind of wanted to kind of get back on that basis just a little bit to start this evening. And this is B.F. Franklin, right? Benjamin Franklin, but not the Benjamin Franklin. But I thought it's kind of interesting. I thought maybe it would give us a little insight into how worship has changed, you know, over what it was. And then as we go through the rest, you know, we go through these different periods of restoration, right? The first Great Awakening, or the start of it, and then what we call the Second Great Awakening, which is really what Stone Campbell came to. There's what's called a Third Great Awakening in the 80s. But, you know, as this occurred, largely Protestant movement was shifting away from, in the United States, from Catholicism. Mostly, that was a lot of what drove that. But I thought this was kind of interesting. In the early days of preaching, the mourner's bench was considered a very important part of the process of salvation. Many would be preached to about the love of the Savior and the doom of hell. And when the invitation was extended, the people would come to the front and wail because of their sins, and they would pray that God would come into their hearts and relieve them of their sins. B.F. Hall started noticing that people were not getting relief at the mourner's bench. If you remember from the start of this, B.F. Hall, he really came into the restoration pretty early, came from a large family, felt that he wanted to be a preacher. His dad told him that if he did, he could never come home, and he would cut him out of the will, right? And B.F. Franklin went to be a preacher anyway. So he did a lot, traveled a lot, pretty good history behind him. But he had become a preacher anyway in spite of that. He really didn't have any money, really couldn't afford school, went to live with his sister, and his sisters, well, they were Presbyterians, and her sister's husband said, you know, if you'll be a Presbyterian preacher, I'll pray for you to go to school. But he didn't want to do that, and so he just started preaching. And then he came across this. He was going on this, he'd been preaching. He was going home. It was late. He stopped at this house, which is where we're at now. He said people were not getting relief at the mourner's bench. And he was much frustrated and moved in emotion at their plight. It was around the spring of 1826 when he was traveling from Tennessee back to his home in Kentucky. It was getting late in the day as he approached the farm of a brother, Jess, on Line Creek. And while waiting for supper, Hall looked upon his small collections of books on his shelf in the corner of the cabin. One of the books was the Campbell-Macaulay debate. In October 1823, Alexander Campbell, then a Virginia Baptist, had debated William L. Macaulay, a Presbyterian, on the subject of baptism. Macaulay taught that sprinkling babies, pedial baptism, was in keeping with Scriptures and was causing great difficulty among the Baptists in northern Kentucky. It was said that Macaulay was like smoke in their eyes and thorns in their sides. Hall had heard that the debate was in print, but had not read it. His thoughts as he read were recorded in an unpublished autobiography years later. He wrote, Mr. Campbell's speech, in which he introduced the design of baptism, arrested my notice. I began to read it with fixed attention. The interest deepened as I proceeded. The light began to dawn. Nay, it flashed upon my mind, and ere I had concluded the argument, I was a full convert to the teaching of baptism for remission of sins. I sprang to my feet in an ecstasy and cried out, Eureka, Eureka, I have found it, I have found it. I have found the keystone in the gospel arch, which had been set aside, ignored by the builders. I had found the long-lost link in the chain of gospel obedience. I saw now the evidence of remission, which I had never seen before. His mind was so full of newly discovered truths, he could not wait to share it with the crowds of people. He preached it everywhere with great success. People were being relieved of their sins because they saw that they were obeying the gospel call and being baptized. The reason I share this with you in regard to worship is not because I'm preaching to you about baptism tonight. I think it's a great story. Don't get me wrong. I love this story. Eureka, Eureka, I found it. I can just, I love the story. But nevertheless, I'm not sharing it with you because of that tonight. I'm sharing it with you because it gives a little insight into the evolution of worship. And what I mean by that is if we go into an Old Testament setting, And, we've got three dispensations of Bible history. That's how we break it up. We have what's called the patriarchal age, which is from Adam to the Mount, right? And that's where God spoke directly to the heads of households, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Didn't always speak, but that's how God dealt with people. He spoke directly. And then we have what's called the Mosaic age, or the age of the law. And that's the age from Mount Sinai to the crucifixion of Christ. And then we have what's called the Christian age, from the crucifixion of Christ until the end of time. In all those ages, worship has existed. But I think if we really look at Old Testament worship, it was really directed solely in the idea of humbling themselves before God, of sacrifice, of coming to a place, coming before God in order to worship Him. And if you move forward into the Christian age, I think it was largely the same. They came together, and we'll talk about this a little bit tonight, but it's really hard to miss it, I think, if you read the Bible. They came together to take the Lord's Supper, to do certain things, and they assembled to do that, and we know historically they did that on the first day of the week, and in the Scripture that's called the Lord's Day. John calls that the Lord's Day in Revelation. And they did that on the first day of the week. And that seems pretty obvious to me. But what happened is that, it was about 325 AD, right? When Constantine, of course, Christians have been under persecution by Rome for centuries. They got blamed when Rome burned. Nero blamed Christians for Rome burning. Christians were persecuted. Christianity flourished in spite of that. Constantine has his great dream. The Roman emperor has his great dream where he sees the armies of Rome fighting under a gilded cross or a golden cross. So Constantine takes this as a sign from God. And Constantine decides that Christianity is going to be the religion of Rome, the state religion. And so Constantine, he basically establishes the Christian church as the state church. And he gives them a piece of land that still exists. It's called Vatican, the Vatican City, right? He gave them this piece of ground. He gave them a lot of property. He gave them money. He gave them influence. He kind of brought Christianity into this political realm. And when he did that, that's actually what Roman Catholicism, that's what that evolved out of. If we really go back, study church history back that far, Roman Catholicism evolved out of Constantine's making Christianity the church, the religion of the state. Now, that's going to divide in the Great Schism, we call that, where Eastern and Western religion divide, and you have Greek Orthodox, Eastern religion, and you have Roman Catholicism, Western religion. And Greek Orthodox is in Constantinople, and Roman Catholic is in Rome, Vatican City. Our religion in the United States predominantly comes out of Western religion, Roman Catholicism, because our religion comes from Europe. And the Catholic Church became big in Europe until the days that King Henry VIII came along, right? We all know Henry VIII, right? Of Henry VIII, I am, right? And Henry VIII had all the wives, and Henry VIII wanted a divorce, right? And the Pope wouldn't give it to him, wouldn't annul his marriage. Another story, church history, right? So basically, Henry said, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick the Catholic Church out of England. And I'm going to take all their property and all their monasteries, and I'm going to make them the Church of England. And we're going to have another state church, the Church of England. Well, that went along, right, until we came to the part of the beginning of Restoration, the first Restoration. And that's when we got all these great guys that came out of there, Wycliffe and Luther and Calvin and all these great reformers, Zwingli, all these great reformers. And they largely evolved worship from this Roman Catholic system. Now, I was raised kind of Catholic, so I kind of understand a little bit about Catholicism. And I'm going to tell you, there's a marked difference between worship in Catholicism and worship in the Protestant faith. And a lot of that is because as the Protestant movement started to shift away from Catholicism, they really wanted to look as different as they could. So a lot of things that was in Catholicism, the burning of candles, lighting of incense, vestments or robes for priests. A lot of the things that were involved in that, they wanted to just totally look opposite of that. Didn't want any images in churches, even like images on stained glass. Didn't want any objects. Didn't wanted to totally. But another thing that happened is that, and you can see this, I think, in this text, is that it became religion, our worship became very much focused upon conversion. And I think it's really important that we kind of think about that for a half a second. Because I had this interesting conversation. Back up. Had this interesting conversation with a friend of mine. Talked about him this morning. Donnie Williamson sings, goes into all these big churches all over the country, has a gospel group. They sing at all these big congregations all over the place. And I talked to him quite a bit, and Donnie came in one day and we were talking, and he says, I really have a problem with modern Christianity. And I said, huh, really, And I said, what's the problem? And he said, well, he said, all these big churches I go into and we sing, he said, there's not about worship anymore. It's about conversion. He says all these churches are looking for seekers. They're looking to convert people. And the whole service is not built around worship. It's built around the idea of converting people to Christianity. Now, there's nothing wrong with converting people to Christianity, don't get me wrong. And there's nothing wrong with that precept. And what you see in this is the beginning of that evolution, where people said, well, we're going to come down. Now, there's no example of invitations in New Testament worship, like we would have today, or a lot of those things. And so we really got to start to ask ourselves a question. And I think what bothered Donnie, and I think what bothers a lot of people, and I use that word Christianity, however you want to take that in loose sense, Christendom today, is that churches have become so focused upon numbers and upon converting people to, whether you want to say Christ or their religion or their faith, however you want to use that terminology, that they've lost. And what Donnie sees in that, and of course I don't see this because I don't get out. I don't go to those churches to worship. I'm obviously here, and I probably wouldn't anyway. But what he sees is that these churches have become so focused on numbers and so focused on growth and so focused on evangelism that essentially they don't worship. They don't really know what worship is. It's all about trying to get people. And I think that's kind of interesting. And you kind of begin to see this shift in. Now, going back a little bit, that's one thing I'll say about Catholicism as a child, because I would go to Mass at 8 o'clock in the morning, which is way too early to go to church, I might add. And I would go, and then after Mass was over, we would pile in the car, because my mom's Baptist, right? So my stepfather's Catholic. So at 8 o'clock, we'd go to Mass, then we'd pile in the car, and we'd drive across town, and we'd go to the Baptist church. So as a child, I was kind of getting both of these experiences in my life. And one thing that I noticed, even as a child of 10 or 11 years old, is that they were so radically different. And one thing I thought as a kid was, how can that both be right? How can both of those things, being so radically different from each other, how can both of those things be right? But that being said, in the Catholic Mass, it's not about conversion. It's not about an invitation song. It's about, basically what I would say, it's more about God. It's more about just focusing on God for that short period of time. And then as you moved to the Protestant side, it became more about the idea of evangelism. Now, I'm not condoning Catholicism, because I know it has many, many flaws, and I've preached about that many, many times. I'm just simply making a point that when we come to worship, it's important that it's about Christ, about God. In other words, it's wonderful if somebody comes forward, but I'll be honest about it. I really would much rather convert someone through a Bible study and a teaching than I had an emotional sermon. I would much rather convert somebody by teaching them the truth of God and by showing them what God is and had them come to that conclusion. So even though I think it's important we offer that and we have time to pray because we are assembled and we take time to pray, the invitation at the end, and so many times sermons And I hope I don't do that, and I probably do sometimes, depending on the times. I know I do. The sermon shouldn't be focused on getting somebody to walk down the aisle at the end of the sermon. The sermon should be focused on making people consider and think and focus their mind upon God and Jesus Christ. And if the purpose of the sermon is about converting someone in a pew, I'm not sure that sermon is really what God would intend. I think if people are converted because of it, that's great. But I think to focus it upon just that, maybe that's not the purpose of coming together on a Sunday morning. So, something to think about. Probably could disagree with me about that, and that's okay. I'm very happy with people disagreeing about me, right? But let's go back to this word, proskeno. Go back to this Greek word a little bit. Because we talked about there's other words in the New Testament that are translated as worship, like Romans 12, 1 and 2, Acts 13, that really have the meaning of service, not really the meaning of what we would consider to worship, to humble. This word basically, literally means to kiss toward. Really what it means. And I know this is like a lexicon, and I know most of y'all probably don't spend much time in a Greek lexicon, so I'll help you a little, but I want to talk about a little bit this evening. Is that in this word, if you look at this, it says there's 60 occurrences. Now that tells you how many times that occurs in the New Testament. Matthew to the end of Revelation, 60 times. AV means authorized version. So basically it means 60 times in the authorized version. But I want you to look at something here. It translates all 60 times as worship. Now that's significant. You might say, well, why does that matter? Well, because a lot of Greek words carry different meanings. So in different places, they're translated as different words, into different words. But uniquely, this word is only translated worship. Not any other way, only translated as worship. So I thought, well, that's interesting. But I just want to look at this a little different because I thought, well, I've looked at this a lot of times. So I thought, I wonder, of those 60 times that this word is used in the text, I'm thinking, how is it used? Gary kind of talked to me the other day. He goes, well, what's worship? Or is there individual worship and corporate worship, and how are you going to? And Gary's always prodding my mind. How are you going to make that work, and how are you, how are you going to do that? Of course, Gary's already got answers in his head. He's just trying to make me think. I understand that, And so I'm thinking all week. I'm thinking, and I thought, I got to go back and look at that word. And so I broke it down. I took time. I went in there, and I broke this word down in all 60 times it's used in the Bible. And so I counted it out. I went in there, read all these passages, and I said, okay, how's this book used? Well, I said, number one, I'm going to take Revelation out of the picture because Revelation is about heavenly worship, angels worshiping, things worshiping God, scenes in heaven, So number one, I said, I'm not going to use Revelation because really that's talking more about the idea of heaven and angels and things going on in a heavenly realm. And, that's not really going to apply to New Testament Christian worship. So I thought, okay, so let's take Revelation out. So I said, well, that's 24 times. So it's only used 60, right? So I said, there's 24 of them in the book of Revelation, and I'm going to separate that off because that's just heavenly stuff. And I don't think it really has application to what I'm talking about. So I'm going to take that out. So then I said, well, let's look at the Gospels. Okay, so it's 18 times in the Gospels. 18 times that it's used towards Christ. And some of that's individual worship. Matter of fact, a lot of it is. Where the leper would come back and fall down, and the man that was born blind would worship God, fall down and worship God. It's also used about Satan. When Satan says, if you'll worship me, in those texts, that same word's used. So a lot of times it's used towards Christ, either in a sense of things going on with Christ. One time it's used in a parable. The slave that owed the money, right? He came down and it doesn't say worship, but it's the word proskeno. He came and fell down at his master's feet, fell down at the master's feet, which is the same which is that same Greek word. So one time it's used in a parable. 9 times it's used in John 4. And I thought that's really significant because I really need to look at John 4. And that's one thing because I've always, John 4, woman at the well, true worshipers will worship in spirit and in truth. I thought I'm going to set that to the side a little bit. I need to look at that in John 4 because that's kind of interesting. Jesus talking about worship, Samaritan woman at the well. I want to look at that a little bit. And then 2 times it's used in worship basically to other things that aren't God, basically the idea of a worship of an idol or worship of something else. So those times don't really count. 3 times it's talking about temple worship, like in Acts, the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, where he went to the temple to worship. Paul in Acts 24, I was at the temple worshiping. So 3 times it's talking about temple worship in the Bible. 1 time it talks about angels, Hebrews. The angels worshiped God. So 1 time it's talking about angels worshiping. And then 1 time it's Jacob, where it says Jacob worshiped leaning on his staff. So, 1 time it's about Jacob. So I thought, I'm going to add all of them up. And I was astounded. I'm like, that's 59 times. And I'm thinking it's only used 60 times in the whole New Testament. And now I've eliminated 59. And I'm thinking, what's left, right? And so I think about that a little bit, and guess what? The only time is in 1 Corinthians 14:25. That it's not used in one of them other contexts, that it's really talking about worship in a New Testament context. Is in 1 Corinthians 14:25, and I thought, that's astounding. I never had really looked at that before. So, Gary's got me thinking, right? Which is good. I need people to make me think, because sometimes my brain doesn't start on its own. So I'm doing this, and I get down to that, and so I think, now what am I going to do, right? I've got this one passage, right? And I'm thinking, so now, where do I go from here, right? What's a logical step? And so I'm thinking, well, I need to look at 1 Corinthians 14, obviously, because that seems to have significance. And then I'm thinking, and I'm going to look at the word assembly, right? Because that's the logical conclusion. We're talking about corporate worship. We're talking about assembly. So I need to look at that word, assembly. So I thought, well, I got to look at 1 Corinthians 11. I got to look at Acts chapter 2. Got to look at Acts chapter 20. And I need to look at, should be John chapter 4, not John 9. I need to look at John chapter 4 because at the beginning of this, when I saw John 4, I'm like, I really need to look at that a little bit. So I'm thinking, okay, so if we really think about this for a minute, and we're really focusing on this word, and we've gone through here, and we've separated all this off, and we've gone through this logically, and we're down to this point, and I'm thinking, question am I really trying to answer here in my mind, What question am I really trying to answer? So I'm looking at church history, I'm looking at restoration, I'm looking at the shift in worship in early America, and I'm looking at the shift in worship now in our society, and I'm comparing Catholicism and maybe Greek Orthodox worship to New Testament worship of Protestant religions or denominations, or however you want to look at that, Christianity, Christendom. And I'm thinking, so what am I trying to ask myself? And I'm thinking, well, what I want to know is, I want to know what our worship should look like. I mean, that's primary, right? I want to know when we come together to worship God, what are we supposed to look like? That's what I want to know. And the other thing, and Gary made me think about this, and I think it's really important, is is there such a thing as individual and corporate worship, right? Is there such a thing as can I worship individually, and do I have to worship corporately or together? And is that different? I thought, that's a good question. And then I said, so what should that look like, right? What should it look like? So I thought, well, those are all good questions. So I need to try to answer them. So I thought, Rex, you're never going to do this in one Sunday night, number one. But I thought, okay, so let's think about it for a minute. And so I thought, well, if I can draw some conclusions. So then I'm thinking, okay, let's back up again, I'm thinking in my head. And let's just look at it all the way through. Genesis to Revelation. Let's just look at it. And let's just try to draw some conclusions about worship in general. And so I'm thinking, so I'm going all the way back, and I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about Abraham, and I'm thinking about these Hebrew words, and Abraham offering Isaac, first time worship's used, shachah in the Hebrew, first time that's used. And I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about Jacob worshiping God, leaning on a staff. In the end of Genesis, I'm thinking about, the Mount Sinai, assembling to worship God. When you worship me in this mountain, you'll know that I've delivered you out of Egypt. And then I'm thinking all the way up to New Testament, and I'm thinking up to the time of Christ and temple worship and all these things, and throughout all of history. And I think, there's some conclusions, number one, that have never changed. And one of those is worship is purposeful. And you think, well, that's kind of stupid to say that. Why would you even say that? And I said, well, because, I hear so many people say today, and we just throw that word around, worship around. Well, I'm worshiping God. I hear that all the time from people, I'm going to do this, and I'm worshiping, this is how I'm worshiping God. And people just throw that word. They throw it around all the time. And I thought, one thing I know throughout Scripture, whether I'm talking about Genesis or whether I'm talking about, whether I'm talking about Numbers and Deuteronomy or whether I'm talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke or whether I'm talking about Revelation, I said one thing I know is that worship is a purposeful act. It's not something I just fall into. It's something I decide to do, and it is purposeful. It has purpose, and it's driven by that. And so many times in the Bible, worship was about going to do it. And I think that's really, really important. Abraham goes to offer Isaac. The children of Israel go to the mount. The Israelites under the Mosaic law go to the temple. And I think that's really significant. And then I thought, well, what about Christian worship? So I thought, well, so we'll get into that, What are they, so is it the same thing? Was it this purposeful act? And then I thought the other thing, the very word means to kiss toward something. Kiss toward God. The very word means towards God. Not towards each other, not towards whatever. The very word means towards God. And worship has to be focused to that end. And if our worship is focused towards another end, another goal, than towards God, then the question inevitably has to be, are we really worshiping? And so if we come and assemble together on a Sunday morning, and the whole purpose of our assembly is about converting someone to Christ, then I would pose a question, right? Is our worship about God? Or is it about converting someone? It's not a bad thing to convert somebody to Christ. Don't get me wrong. I'm all about it. But the inevitable question becomes, why are we here? Right? Why are we here? That's a hard question sometimes. Why do you get up on Sunday morning and come to worship? I'll be honest. A lot of times I could come to worship. I sat out there a long time before I stood up here, right? And a lot of times on Sunday morning when I came to worship, I don't know that I walked through that door thinking, I'm really here to focus on God and that's it. I don't think I can say that and be truthful with you. And I think there's multiple reasons for that. And so when I show up, and I know we're out of time and I'm going to quit, promise. I know when we show up to worship, if I purposed in my heart, do I walk through those doors on a Sunday morning and think, I'm here to kiss God. I'm here to get down on my face before God. I'm not saying physically do it, but I'm here in my heart to get down on my face before God and to say, you're my King and you're my Lord, and I'm here to worship you. And I honestly can't say that I do that every Sunday morning. that I have. Why? Why do we get up and go? Well, it's habit, maybe. Something we always do. Expected to do it, maybe. But worship, we'll talk about next Sunday night, really begins within the heart of man. You know, we talk about the physical. Why am I here? I'm here to do these things. But if I'm just here to do those things, I'm not really worshiping God. I'm here to do those things. And the things I do should come out of my desire to worship. And you say, well, extra splitting hairs. No. Worship begins within the heart of man. It begins within us, within here. Why am I here? What am I here to do? What am I here to accomplish? What's my goal at the end of my worship service? What's my goal? My goal should be to worship God and for God to be proud of what I did. And if we really break it down to that basic level, then I think we really begin to understand what coming to worship is all about. And why God says, or why it's purposeful, and why it's go and do it. And it has to have that because it has to start within my heart and my desire to do it. And it has to come with the idea of when, number one, you have to ask yourself the question, why am I coming on Sunday morning? Why am I walking through that door on Sunday morning? And the second question you have to ask yourself is at the end of it, what am I supposed to accomplish? You know, why does God want me to come do this? What's the accomplishment of me doing this? What's the outcome of my action? Is the outcome of my action to be able to say, well, I came, Lord, and I sang and I prayed and I gave and I heard a sermon? Right? Or is the goal of my being here to say, I came and humbled myself and I kissed God's hand? Right? And guess what? All these other things happened. But I didn't just show up here to take communion. I didn't just show up here to give. I didn't just show up here to sing. I didn't just come up here to hear a sermon. I came here to worship my God. And when that happens, all these other things happen. So it's really made me think, and I hope it makes you think, you know, and I don't want you to think the wrong way, you know, I hope not. But it really has made me think about what we do and why we do it. And can we do it wrong? Absolutely. Absolutely. Can we worship in a way that God says, I'm really not happy with this? Absolutely. Throughout biblical history, that has occurred. Absolutely. But can we worship in such a way that God says, man, that was great? Absolutely. And the question we need to divine here, the answer we need to divine here, is how can we do it in a way that God says, man, that's just what I wanted. Anyway, out of time. Start again, way out of time. We'll talk about this again next Wednesday night. I hope you're enjoying this. It's been good for me. If we can assist you in any way, won't you let it be known while we stand.